Welcome to the March 10th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today we're going to be talking about all things Mark Carney. He's the new Liberal leader, federal Liberal leader, and that makes him the Prime Minister designate. He was elected yesterday at a convention in Ottawa. So I'm going to be talking to Richard Johnston, who's a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. So welcome to The Energy Show, Richard.
Happy to be here.
This is very interesting. I mean, we've been kind of assuming that Carney would be the winner and the new prime minister, and but he won with 85%, which I think was a little unexpected that there would be that much support for him. What happens next? What are the next steps? He becomes prime minister. When does that happen? How does it happen?
Well, the mechanics are simply that Justin Trudeau advises the Governor General that he is stepping down, but as his last act as Prime Minister, he advises her to summon Carney to form a government. Right? At law, cabinet ministers who are the government actually are accountable to the Governor General. It's the control, or at least the support of a majority in the House, that gives them the moral authority to act on our behalf if in her name.
Now, we have we have a high percentage of international viewers who may not understand the intricacies of the Westminster system to begin with, and then Canada's kind of take on it. So maybe you could explain just very briefly the role of the Governor General, the head of state, in a constitutional monarchy like Canada.
Um, she's the gatekeeper for certain things, except in extraordinary circumstances. She only acts on the advice of the Prime Minister. There are moments in which she should not, but they're rare. The precedents are very few, and in many cases they're contested. For example, there was a question back in December about whether she should accept the advice of Trudeau to prorogue Parliament. There was no question that part of the reason was to avoid a confidence vote. So was that somehow unconstitutional? Most serious Westminster constitutional scholars would say no, it was not. If he had asked her to prorogue Parliament for a year, that would be different. But in general, she does what the Prime Minister asks her to do. She does so because presumably, and this is kind of the condition, that the Prime Minister is the person who is effectively supported by a majority of the members of the House. Usually that's not a difficult thing to identify. If it's a majority government, it's dead simple. If it's a minority government, there's a bit more thinking required. But the number of Liberals in the House is so close to a majority that there's no question who the government is.
Gotcha. Let's talk about the Carney as the next prime minister and pushing back against Donald Trump and President Donald Trump and his threats to annex Canada, his threat of tariffs. We're going to be seeing some of those very quickly on aluminum and steel. Did Carney need a mandate to negotiate or to push back against Trump?
He wouldn't need a mandate for certain kinds of things, just as the fact that in some sense Trudeau didn't really have a mandate to do that either. But no one questioned his authority to do certain things, e.g., under kind of emergency rules to impose tariffs or threaten to. The hard part comes when pushing back against Trump requires positive legislation, possibly changes to tax regimes or new spending. We don't know what they would spend it on, but what if they had to enhance unemployment insurance, for example? That sort of thing. That the problem with the government as it is now is that its mandate to govern in a positive sense is in doubt, partly because, or mainly because, at a critical moment, all of the opposition parties said that they would combine to bring the government down, so that there was serious doubt about the government's ability to deliver on anything that required positive legislation, real legislative activity. So, from that point of view, having an election uh, at least creates the possibility that there will be a workable governing majority next time, whether it's conservative or liberal.
The speculation is that the election is going to be called fairly quickly, and the dates that have been mentioned for election day are April 28th and May 5th. Federal government elections are usually 6 weeks long. Are you in the majority that thinks that it'll be a quick call?
I'm sort of weakly in the majority. I think that so the question is, would Carney even bother to summon Parliament? Um, if so, then Parliament won't arrive until the 24th. There's a certain amount of ceremonial stuff. There would have to be a speech from the throne. And so, one argument for that is that the speech from the throne would lay out at least an elementary program of how to deal with Trump. Um, Maybe there's an argument for putting that program on the table, calling that the Liberal platform, and inviting the opposition to defeat the party. Um, it might be embarrassing if they don't. I think there's some question about whether the NDP would go through on its commitment to bring the government down, for example. And so part of it is a strategic question about whether he thinks the best way, the best pathway to a liberal majority, or at least a liberal survival, would be to be preemptive, uh, set the agenda by stating a basic platform, and take it from there. But basically, what I'm talking about is a couple of weeks window. It's either virtually the moment the government is formed, or mere days after Parliament resumes. Either way, we're looking at a campaign in April or May. The campaign. The other question is, how long should the campaign be? Right, 35 days is the minimum, but it could actually be quite a bit longer if it seems somehow appropriate. Uh, I don't know that Mr. Carney would have any particular interest in lengthening the campaign. Uh, it might depend on the next few polls.
Well, let's talk about that because it wasn't that long ago, 2, 3 months ago, that Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, his party was way out in front. I mean, we were talking about the Liberals being decimated under,
Yep.
Trudeau ran again. And since the Justin Trudeau decided to step down, there's been a leadership race, and amazing reversal. Have you ever? Some polls have the Liberals ahead, some have them even. I saw one this morning from Abacus Data where the Liberals were still behind, but easily within. They could easily catch the CPC. What's your take on all of that?
Well, um, we have seen this a couple of times before for the Liberals, and things did not end well. Well, actually, Liberals and Conservatives, right? So, in 1984, the hubbub around the Liberal leadership race, where John Turner defeated Chrétien, they went from sort of the low 20s to as high as the high 40s. In those days, polls were almost all Gallup polls, actually, but that was they bounced back strikingly far on the basis of which John Turner dissolved Parliament and then just got smashed. It all fell apart after the two debates a couple of weeks into the campaign. And then in '93, the Conservatives went through a pretty similar trajectory. They were in the teens when Mulroney stepped aside. Um, all the polls suggested that the only avenue of recovery was to go to Kim Campbell, and so she became the presumptive candidate and won, although it was a shaky leadership campaign. But even so, by July or August of 1993, the Conservatives were at least within spitting distance. And that campaign opened with the Tories maybe 2 or 3 percentage points behind the Liberals. And again, it all blew up. Now, That could happen again this time. Uh, I should point out that there is an additional wrinkle, which was true in 1984, and in a funny way, kind of true in 93 as well. And that is, in each case, the party that recovered and then collapsed replaced a Quebec leader with a non-Quebec leader. So that's an issue that sort of hangs out there about Carney in particular. Um, that said, uh, I, I don't think Carney is quite like those two predecessors. He's he's never been in elective politics, unlike both Turner and Campbell. Uh, but there is this kind of technocratic thing going on with him. The fact that he actually really is an adult in the room, that he's done actual policy at the highest conceivable level. It's not it's not it's not the kind of bread and butter policy that politicians normally deal with. It is obviously monetary policy, but those are policy choices with actual impact on people's lives that require a degree of alignment with the governing party. So he's kind of been in the highest reaches, and it shows.
For our international viewers, we should mention that Carney was the former governor of the Bank of Canada, and he steered Canada through the financial crisis that started in 2007, 2008, went into 2009. Was poached by the of England, became their governor, steered them through Brexit, which is highly controversial. But that kind of he's made a big deal in his campaign about being a crisis manager. He's done this. He knows what to do, and he does bring that technocratic air to this. I can manage things, but he's also got this kind of I want to call it avuncular. He looks like somebody who's comfortable. You can trust him. Is that's my perception of him? Maybe is that your perception, and what role does perception play in an election?
Well, it's not a critical thing in every election, but in some elections, quote, leadership is the question. And in a way, that's what Donald Trump has handed to the Liberal Party, in a manner of speaking, snatched away from Pierre Poilievre. That leadership as such wasn't going to be the issue. Now, all of a sudden, it is. And although Carney has not had to deal with a random wild card like Donald Trump, although Brexit had some of those elements in it, uh, um, who better? I mean, there's a sense in which he's the upside. We don't really know what he can do, but he's a better bet from that point of view than someone who has been essentially a parliamentarian all his adult life, and only at the fringes of power under Harper.
Yeah, so it'd be Polyev sat in Harper's cabinet as a junior cabinet minister
Right,
for a few years,
right.
but other than that, hasn't really done. Certainly hasn't actually. While he's run in elections for his own writing, he's never managed a run as leader. This will be new for him.
That's right. And but he was well positioned to take advantage of the woes of the liberals, the largely self-inflicted woes. And so if it's a comparison game, which it inevitably is, almost anybody would come off better than Justin Trudeau. All of a sudden, they've pulled this guy out of the hat.
And I want to talk about some of the key advisors here because this is has a role on where Carney might go as a prime minister. Because I read an excellent article that argued that Carney is a technocrat, which means that he doesn't like to pull a few levers really hard. He likes to nudge a lot of policy levers a little bit. Very much kind of an incrementalist on the policy front. And that may or may not work facing Donald Trump, who has threatened tariffs, threatened annexation, threatened, to take, to redraw the country's borders. I mean, how does that Carney's role play into, the crisis management that we just talked about?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I guess that two things occur to me. One, if you're the governor a bank, as in the bank of a country, you know, actually, you need to be very careful and very strategic about what you say and about what the levers you pull signal about your intentions for the next play in the game, right? So think about the Bank of Canada 2.5 years ago, when all of a sudden we have supply shocks and inflation. Uh, the worry was that inflationary expectations would come to be implanted. That union negotiators would think, you know what, our prices they're just going to keep going up. We need to start making demands commensurate with inflation. So there was an issue there about whether inflationary expectations, and so part of it is deducing whether that's happening in the labor market. And then there's the question of how do you send a sufficiently firm signal that the bank will do what is necessary to halt inflation. So that is the kind of communication and signaling task that governors of national banks have to emit, right? And then, of course, they also have to coordinate with fiscal policy. And so from that point of view, that strikes me as generically the kind of signaling that is called for in dealing with Trump as well. And Trudeau has actually been pretty good at that, right? Conveying firmness. And so the decision not to rescind the preliminary round of tariffs, for example, is a pretty effective signal. So it seems to me that from that point of view, Carney comes kind of pre-packaged to do that kind of stuff. And then in terms of the delicacy of things, well, I think obviously there are times in which if you're making war with the U.S., you may have to be very firm about taking certain positions, but you may have to be delicate about withdrawing from them. Beyond that, though, if that's his manner, so be it. I don't know the inside story of how he ran the banks.
I was reading just today that one of his acknowledged strengths is exactly in what you just said,
Right.
signaling where interest rates are going, where is monetary policy going, those sorts of things. He's apparently very good at that. So that might be a strength of his in dealing with Donald Trump. I wanted
Yes.
to close out the interview with talking about a couple of his, a key advisor. Gerald Butts was a key uh, player in the first Trudeau government from 2015 to 2019, and then he left, kind of fell on his sword for the a big scandal. And that was perceived as being a weakness of the Trudeau governments afterwards. Well, Jerry Butts has been advising Carney, and I wonder, is that perceived as a strength that Carney will have the Mandarin in the PMO's office if Butts does that? Could that be a big factor coming up in terms of how Carney's perceived and how he proceeds with Trump?
In terms of how he deals with Trump, I don't know if he needs Butts to do that. Here's the worry I would have, that to the extent that Butts is the advisor on domestic politics, I mean, I don't doubt that he is a sharp strategic actor, but Carney has to be careful that he loses the dad component or the uncle component. The kind of plain speaking technocrat. If that's what Canadians want, he wants to stick with that, as far as reasonable at least. He doesn't want to become too cute about policy making, too political. I mean, let me give you an example of cuteness in politics that was a weakness of the current government. The carbon tax, right? I mean, a bold initiative, virtually the only major country to enact one and stick with it. But not once could Justin Trudeau actually explain to Canadians what it was, or why it was necessary. Nobody, nobody, I exaggerate, but very few people understood that those rebates that were coming back were actually connected to the carbon tax that they were paying. And honestly, I don't know if you ask Canadians, how much are you paying in the carbon tax? They could answer that question. So this incredibly bold initiative, obviously divisive, but nonetheless, there was a case for it. It was the economist's ideal minimal interventionist way of changing behavior vis-a-vis fossil fuels. Doesn't go down well in Alberta, but that's not a surprise. But they could never explain it. They created this rather Rube Goldberg like, take some from here and take some from there, that just invites being interpreted as a money grab. And so to me, that was too political, too fine tuned, insufficiently justified. So if Gerald Butts comes in there to advise the person who was chosen because he's not that much of a politician to become more of one, more than is necessary, then I would worry about his ultimate saleability, including in the next election.
So I get what you're arguing is that Carney has to stick with this plain speaking. He's got to, and he's
Yeah,
pretty good at it.
yeah,
I've
yeah.
interviewed a lot of economists, and he does a pretty good job of explaining that sort of thing. And that he
Yeah.
has to stick with that.
Well, and he is a real economist. He's not pretending. He's one of
Yeah,
the few economists who actually has taken a job dealing with the economy.
exactly.
So
Now, speaking of the
that's the sell, so to speak.
speaking of the economy, we did a story yesterday on Jonathan Wilkinson, who's the Canada's energy minister. His title is Natural Resources Minister, but essentially he's the energy minister. And he was interviewed in the Globe and Mail, and he essentially he said, "Why do we need a pipeline?" Because for international viewers, one of the responses to Trump's putting tariffs on Canadian oil and gas going into the exports into the U.S. Has been to say we need to build new pipelines so that we can go east and west and go out into international markets. Canada is the fourth largest oil producer in the world. We're not small potatoes in this. And Wilkinson said, there's no case. It's economically tenuous to look at this kind of thing. And I wonder where, given Carney's comments about maybe building pipelines, is somebody like Wilkinson likely to stick around, assuming he gets reelected, stick around in a Carney cabinet?
Good question. I mean, that's a rhetorical question that he put, and it reminds me of Pierre Trudeau's question about why should I sell your wheat, which stuck to him for his entire career, even though it was a rhetorical question, which he then set about to answer. But nobody remembered that. And if I recall Wilkinson's comment correctly, a large part of what he was saying was there's plenty of unused capacity in TMX, and there is a pipeline. And by God, the Liberals built it. uh, so I think if that's what he was talking about, then he can be forgiven from Carney's point of view. But he may have created a hostage to fortune that may make his continuation in that portfolio doubtful. I guess I wonder whether a pipeline, whether he also had in mind whether a pipeline that's delivering dilbit to Montreal or wherever for export, what's the market? I mean, at least the heavy stuff that we send to the U.S. complements the light stuff coming out of shale. So there's a complementarity there. And I can't help but notice that pretty much all the shipments coming through Vancouver are essentially going to Los Angeles. So,
Well, actually, the data, I came across some data the other day about half are going to Asia and half are going to California.
okay.
So, but it does change over time. But the our point here at Energy Media has been very simple. There are two risk factors that are not being taken into account, and one of them is climate change, because as the market and governments price emissions high emissions intensity oil will be at a disadvantage. And that's the
Right.
oil sands is one of the highest in the world. The second is the global energy transition, which is rarely discussed in Canada. I mean, that's our what we mainly report on here, but is galloping ahead in Asia and Europe. Is dismissed as a risk factor. I mean, the International Energy Agency is calling for peak oil demand in 2030, and one of their scenario, two of their scenarios show demand declining rather rapidly after 2030, which would spell bad news for the oil sands. And would why would you build a pipeline? Or we won, never mind two or three under those scenarios. And so we argue that the business case for a new pipeline simply hasn't been made. And we need
Right.
more data. We need to understand the market better. We need to understand the economics better. And without that, no public money, none in a pipeline. If the private sector won't do it, then so that's our take and why we're interested in Wilkinson.
Well, then to go back to where this particular part of the conversation started, we're dealing with a public that hasn't had the question fully framed.
Yeah.
And again, where were the liberals on that framing? I mean, there was a powerful case. They never really made it, other than a few flourishes, and they certainly did not tie it concretely to the policy choices that they made. So
Yeah, there's a very good argument that the Liberals' suite of climate policies, because there's been a clean electricity regulation and clean fuel standards and an oil and gas emissions cap and all of those, in addition to the carbon tax, there's been a lot of a fairly robust suite of climate and energy oriented policies come out of the government, and they've done a crap job of selling every one of them.
right, and here's the ultimate irony from the Alberta point of view. I don't think there would have been a carbon tax if Rachel Notley had not been Premier of Alberta at the time. The deal was, we'll buy you a pipeline, you support us on the carbon tax. It seemed like brilliant politics at the time.
It did indeed, and look where we're at. But that's Chris for another conversation. Richard, thank you very much for this. You've been very enlightening, and we really appreciate it.
I was happy to do this. It's very interesting, all this stuff.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.